Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 4.12, and in this lesson we're going to take another look at one of Bitwig's very unique features, which is the effects within effects feature. And it's something that you've probably seen a number of times when I've been going through here and have just kind of disregarded. Well, now we're going to finally talk about it. So the effects within effects is a very simple concept, really. And for the most part, you might use this a lot when you have really long effects chains working. And so instead of just having to run everything in series, there will be some nuanced differences to dropping an effect within the effect itself. Okay, so instead of having to control 2 dry wet mixes, you only have to control 1 for the most part. So if I load up a ton of effects in here and make a really complicated effect, I have only 1 mix control here that will affect all of those guys. So just as an example here, I've actually loaded them all up in here. And for the most part, I'm going to ask you guys to experiment on your own with how these work, with a few exceptions. So here's just the first example. We have our bit 8 going, and you see there's a little option here for wet FX. All you have to do is click that, open it up, and then you can drop something in. So for now, let's just delete it, and let's listen to what this sounds like. So I've set this up on Ascend. Okay, so for right now, we'll just solo this. Maybe turn it down. Again, this is at 100%, so we're not really hearing too much of our original signal come through, but that's okay because this is all about listening to what happens when we drop an effect within here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a reverb. So we can obviously hear that this reverb is having an effect. But let's listen to what happens when I turn down this mix knob here. Right, so as I go down lower and lower, not only do we remove the bit 8, but we also are removing that reverb effect as well. And that's really the whole point of using the effects within effects, because otherwise what I could do is I could delete the reverb from here, add it just after the fact, not within the bit 8, but just on its own in serial. And now obviously we hear the reverb and we can mix in some of this bit 8. And if I turn the reverb mix down to 0, we're still going to hear the bit 8. Turn that down. They're both off. So that should make sense to you. You can even take it a step further, right? And you could drop the reverb back in here and then turn the reverb off. Turn this on. You can hear the reverb's off. And then what makes this really cool is that if we want, we can open up the macros. And now if I want, I could, for example, turn this down to 0. Map this to the mix of my reverb. And so now when I'm playing this back, when I want to add in reverb, I could. Okay, so that's really the crux of the effects within effects. And you're going to see this in a number of different effects. Here in the chorus, we again have just a wet effects, so it's going to work exactly the same way. Inside of the delay, these are a little bit more interesting. We have feedback effects. So it's going to be affecting just those delayed signals. So this one works best when we have a little bit of the original still coming through. But for the most part, let's focus on those delays and play it back. And we'll send to the delay. So you can hear those delays, I take it, and we'll even filter them a little bit more so you can really hear the difference. And now within feedback effects, I can drop whatever I want. So maybe I'll put in the chorus. And if we solo this, and then maybe I'll also add on here the frequency shifter. And then again, just to give you guys the full scope of all of this, let's take this out of solo. Go in here, map the mix on the chorus. Go in here, map the mix of the frequency shifter. And as this is playing back, then of course our global mix control right here, we'll take them all the way like so. So that's how it's going to work on the delay. The ones that are really interesting are the dynamics and on the gate. So I'm going to go back to those in just a second. So let's take a look at the reverb. The reverb is the next one that's a little bit different. We have our wet effects, which is going to work very similar to what we just saw with the delay and with the other guys, but we also have this TNK effect. And so the TNK is going to affect just specifically this tank portion. So we'll just experiment around with this. There's really no right or wrong answers. I'll probably just use a chorus on both so we can hear the differences. And then obviously, again, you guys should go in and experiment with this further. So let me just turn off the send to the delay, and we'll turn up the send to the reverb. Play this back. All right, cool. We're getting some signal through the reverb. Let's get a little bit bigger of a space, shall we? Okay, so we can start with there's already something in the tank that I'm gonna get rid of. Okay, so we'll go into the wet effects first, and we'll add a flanger. And if we want to take this a step further, we could add something wet inside of the flanger. So perhaps we'd add like the bit 8. And then inside of the bit 8, we could also then add, say, a filter. The filter is a little bit more destructive. And here's what we started with. And here's what we ended up with. Right, so absolute insanity, and again, we could take this out and we could map this to a variety of different parameters. But let's go ahead and just get out of the wet effects. And instead, take a look at this tank effects setting, and I'm going to add another flanger in here, and we'll take a listen to the difference. Let's try to get the same setting, and then we'll just listen to the differences here. There's really no way of explaining it other than you just have to listen and hear the nuance differences here. This one here is much more subtle. right? So incredibly subtle. If anything, it's just kind of turning things down a little bit. Maybe the flanger is not the best thing to mess around with inside of the tank, but feel free to experiment. Maybe we'll do the bit 8 again, just because that can be incredibly destructive. And let's hear what this gives us. Okay, so this has a kind of nice sound to it. Okay, so I kind of like that. But compare that to dropping this into the wet section. Ah, yay. We're going to option click and drag it. All right, so in the wet, you can really hear this. In the tank, a little bit more subtle. It just actually adds a little bit more atmosphere, which is pretty cool. Again, go in here and experiment. The point here is to just grasp the concept, and honestly, I haven't played around with this enough to have any idea what's going to sound really cool or interesting in the tank, so maybe some of you guys can give me some pointers here, because I'm still not 100% sure what to drop in there. Moving right along, let me just make sure I remember to go back here and turn this down. We can look at the ring modulator. Now this one's a little bit different. This one allows us to have effects going either pre-ring modulator or post-ring modulator. But again, they're all going to be dependent on this mix knob. So let's mess around with this real quick. Did I send it there? There you are. Okay, so maybe in pre, we'll actually put in a frequency shifter. And post, we'll put in a frequency shifter as well. Maybe we could also drop a reverb in the post. In the pre, let's do something a little bit different. Let's put a delay 2 in here. Right, you can't tell me that's pretty cool if you just look at this thinking all we have is this ring modulator on here. And then inside of the wet, maybe we could add another ring modulator. That would then be manipulated by a frequency shifter. And then when we just want to pull the whole effect down, instead of having to do each one manually, we can just go in and pull it down from here. Wow, that was really cool. Last but not least, I'm going to show you guys what happens when you drop things into the effects portions on the dynamics or on the gate. So this one works a little bit differently, and I'm just going to delete all the rest of these send effects right now so I don't get myself all sorts of confused. So if I drop in a dynamics effect, here. What you need to focus on when we drop things into the effects, it's not that when compression kicks in, that effect is implemented. I think that would be really cool if that's what happened, but that's not the case. In fact, it works a little bit differently from that. So what's going to happen when we actually drop effects in here is that the gain reduction is actually going to be impacted by the hypothetical effect of one of these other effects on the signal. That made no sense. It just makes sense for me to show this to you guys. So here we go. Let's dial in some compression. Okay, let's get something very noticeable. Fast release as well. Okay, so you see how this gain reduction meter is going and jumping pretty quick, right? What happens is if I put in a reverb, and this reverb has like a very long sort of reverb time and it's washy and it's big, I want you guys to watch and see how the compression changes and how the gain reduction changes. And here we go. Right, so it's anticipating that this reverberated signal has been brought in, when in reality, that's not at all what's happened. Okay, so that's what's going to happen when you're using effects inside of the reverb. And even if we do choose to sidechain this, it's now going to be impacting the sidechain as well. Ready? 3, 2. And that actually is bringing in some really kind of cool and funky artifacts that I like, but you can just hear the big difference. But again, the reverb's not actually doing anything. It's not really adding in any signal as far as I can tell. It just seems to be running through here and then impacting how the gain reduction is taking place. Perhaps that's not what it's supposed to be doing, but that is what it's doing. It would be really cool if every time the compressor kicked in, the reverb turned on and you could hear it, but I've tried this with a number of different effects and it just seems to impact how the gain reduction is taking place. All right, very, very cool. Last but not least, we have the gate, and the gate is going to work exactly the same way. If I pull this in here and set the sidechain onto the drum loop, just going to show you a quick little fun trick you can use, though. Okay, so again, if I put the reverb on here, excuse me, in the effects section, we all know what's going to happen. It's going to be exactly like what happened in our dynamics effect. If this is a long reverb time and we focus that on the late and we turn this way up, we actually have to completely dial in new settings. And because this is such a long tail on the reverb, it's going to be very difficult to actually get something that sounds similar to what we had before. Although those artifacts that come in do sound kind of cool in my opinion. But let's take it a different direction. Let's say I put the reverb after the gate. So you can hear that our reverb continues to trail on after the fact. It's not, the gate isn't going to be turning the reverb on and off because the reverb is occurring after the gate. But let's see what happens if I flip that in the other direction. So now this is pretty cool because now our reverb is actually being triggered only, well, it's happening all the time, but when the gate cuts off, it also cuts off the reverb, which is a pretty cool effect sometimes, especially if this was going like a little bit quicker. Let's turn that. Let's see if we can get this to work. No. So that's pretty cool as well, I think, and I hope that this has been somewhat helpful for you guys. I hope all of these effects within effects have made sense. You can take it out as far and as crazy as you want, or you can keep it relatively simple and not even use them if you don't want to. Some of the places where you'll commonly maybe want to is going to be on those delay lines. You're going to want to maybe just impact how that delayed signal is being affected. And so my guess is you're going to find that that's going to be the most maybe practical application of this. But again, this gives you more flexibility, it gives you more control, and it gives you the opportunity to create sounds that are unique to you that nobody else is going to be able to come up with. Whether they're even using, a whole host of third-party plugins doesn't matter, because you can actually impact how the sound is affected within, and you can actually drop in third-party plugins into these sections as well, which I haven't done, but you can do it. So thank you so much for watching, and you will hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.